The Isle of Man often brags about being the first place in the world to grant women the right to vote, so why have we had to wait for nearly a century and a half since that historic decision was taken for the House of Keys to reflect the fact that half the population are women? This House of Keys has more women MHKs than any house before it, so why do we still need to encourage more women to stand? My guests on Perspective this week have some of the answers.
Yeah, my name's Peter Edge. I'm a Professor of Law at Oxford Brookes University, and I have an abiding interest in Manx law, Manx legal history and Manx constitutional issues.
I'm Katrina Mackey. I'm lecturer in History and Heritage at University College Isle of Man, and I have a real interest in Manx culture, heritage and identity.
So Peter, just to start with then, women in Manx politics, latterly, we've had quite a few. Why do we need to study these matters?
Katrina and I started talking about this as a topic probably around about 2016, 2017, when there were improvements. You know, we were starting to move towards a more representative Tynwald, but there was still a long way to go. And so we put together a project which would take a long view on women in Manx politics, all the way back to 1919, when women were first able to join the House of Keys. They weren't able to join the Legislative Council until the 60s. So all the way back to 1919. And we wanted to look at the history. We wanted to actually look at elections, candidates who stood. And then as we moved into the 21st century, we wanted to talk to women who had stood for the Keys, successfully or unsuccessfully, and also women who'd chosen not to stand, to try and understand what had made them decide that wasn't a route that they wanted to take. So we actually secured funding for the project just before a general election, which revolutionised the number of women in the Keys. But we still thought there were some really interesting things to explore, particularly with women MHKs and former MHKs.
And Katrina, why did you have that conversation? What prompted you to have that conversation?
To be honest, I think it was primarily prompted by Lord Lisvane's review of the functioning of Tynwald, which came out just before the 2016 general election. And at that point, there were only 2 women in the House of Keys. And he identified this as a real problem, this lack of gender diversity in Tynwald. But he didn't offer any solutions as to how we might go about fixing the issue. And then, of course, in the 2016 election, you have 5 women elected to the House of Keys. And so there's a question there about whether we start to see a kind of tipping point and whether this is something that's going to continue. And therefore, potentially, what can we learn by looking at how things worked in the past, and do we have any periods in the past where we had significant numbers of women MHKs, and what were their experiences? And as Peter said, we really kind of wanted to get to the heart of the issue of what was preventing women from standing, because one of the things that we identified through the research was it's not that women were standing and not being elected at in the same proportion as men. It's just the fact that there weren't enough women standing, and what were the barriers there that were in place, and what might we be able to do to encourage more women to stand for election.
So what are the barriers then, Peter?
I think you need to ask yourself, what is it that a woman who's not an MHK is looking into the chamber and in the process and into the life is thinking? Because to us, it was very much a matter of individual choice. As Katrina said, once a woman had decided to stand, historically, all the way back to the mid 20th century, the chance of a woman actually being elected were pretty much exactly the same as a male candidate. So that the decision to stand was the issue. It was that pipeline. And when we looked at some of the 20th century candidates, that there was reference to the priority of childcare. That they saw a significant role in providing that for their family before they could start to think about the Keys. And to give it a more 21st century inflection, I think sort of that work-life balance was a significant issue for some of the women we talked to. I also think that if you read some of the Hansard from the late 20th century, it is tremendously unedifying. And if you were a woman reading the newspapers at the time or attending the chamber yourself, you may think, there are many ways I can serve the Manx community. Why on earth would I put myself through this? So I think those were a couple of the reasons. As we talked to women, and we found really interesting when we talked to who had considered standing but then chose not to, I think one of the things that struck us as really quite surprising was the social media element. Katrina, do you want to run with that?
Yeah, and also I think there is a kind of a trajectory through here from the kinds of attitudes towards women politicians in the 20th century that we see coming out, even through Hansard, that were the kind of views that were being expressed in the Keys and in Tynwald, right through to attitudes towards women politicians now. And for a lot of the women who we spoke to, those who did decide to stand had considered this, and those who didn't decide to stand, this was a major issue for them. It was that why would I put myself in the public eye when I know what kind of a backlash I'm going to get? And not only what impact is that going to have on me, but what impact is that going to have on my family, my children? What is the talk in the playground going to be like for my children when their mother is being lambasted in the media, whether it's on Manx radio, whether it's on social media? These are the things that your family cannot take themselves out of that. They are part of that. So I think that was a really big question. As Peter said, I want to do the best for the Isle of Man, but at what cost to me and to my family?
Does that not, though, also apply pretty much equally to men?
It does, but as with a number of the kind of the issues that we've looked at throughout this project, a lot of them apply equally to men and women, but there are particular gender dimensions that impact on women. So just for example, women very often are the main childcare providers in the home. So they're the ones who are thinking about the children in a slightly different way than perhaps their husbands might be. So they're thinking about how do I balance that me working all hours with looking after the household. And it might not be children, it might be elderly parents, it might be getting food on the table, getting the kids to school. And how do I deal with my children then coming to me and saying, so-and-so in the playground said this about you? Because there's every likelihood it's the mother who's going to have to deal with that. So absolutely, it's not exclusively a problem for women, but I think there are certain gender dimensions to a lot of the research that we looked at.
And who are the most inspiring women in Manx politics? I mean, if you go back, presumably, well, the first one that I saw mentioned in a recent article about this was I can't remember the woman's name, but she was the first one to stand. And that in itself would have been quite something to do, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And actually, just before I get on to talk about her, I would say that I think certainly we have seen some exceptional women in Manx politics, but that to some extent contributes to the problem in that many women think of these people and put them on the pedestal and think, well, I'm not an exceptional woman and therefore I can't stand to be MHK. And so the kind of one of the things we were hearing is that actually we need more women, just women. They don't have to be exceptional, because not all MHKs who are men are exceptional. We just need to have role models who are like us. So, but absolutely, we have had some exceptional women in the past. So Louisa Nelson was quite an interesting character. She almost stood for election in 1924. She was a cafe owner in Ramsey, and she was standing on an Anti-Shop Hours Act ticket. So she didn't want any restrictions brought in on when she could open her cafe. And she submitted her papers and then about an hour later withdrew them. And she withdrew them because she decided to put her weight behind another candidate who was standing on the same ticket. In the end, that candidate did not win, and she determined that she would stand again at the next election, and she did so. So 1929 comes along, and she decides she's going to stand again on the same ticket. And this time, and we'll maybe get on to talk about the role of political parties on the island, but this time the Manx Labour Party almost did a number on her, right. Surprisingly, because at the very last minute, a man came forward and said, I'm going to stand as an independent. And the Manx Labour Party in Ramsey got behind him and lent him their support and everything that involved. And he actually did end up beating the incumbent and taking the seat. So I do wonder whether she felt a little bit aggrieved at that, so because she potentially was in a strong position. Her policies were exactly the same as the man who was eventually elected. So she might have been a little bit aggrieved about that.
And presumably, during your research, you have seen some pretty woeful examples of bias against women, both in terms of what was said in Hansard, but perhaps maybe it's a bit harder to find, but things that would have been said outside of Tynwald as well.
Yeah, I mean, we were very lucky to be able to talk to some former MHKs who had obviously been standing quite deep into the 20th century. So although our interview data tended to be 21st century women politicians, we did manage to go surprisingly far back into the 20th century. And doorstepping was not always a positive experience for women candidates. So they would be asked, who's going to look after your family if I voted for you? Told, I couldn't possibly vote for a woman, including by women voters. Some unpleasantly charged situations in the doorstep when there's a lone woman interacting with a lone man. So I think there were definite issues that people experienced as candidates. And I would say, just to go back to what you said earlier about, surely men are experiencing these as well. I think the doorstep campaigning can be difficult for men on occasion as well. Yeah. And it's a very distinctive feature of the Manx landscape compared with, say, the UK parliamentary campaigning. So you have the doorstep is a potentially difficult place for everybody, but you also find misogynistic views lingering once a woman has been elected. So particular ideas about what a woman should and shouldn't be contributing, how they should be presenting themselves in the chamber, what they bring to a chamber, which is particularly when it was dominated by men. So I think one of the things that struck us really is that it's a journey right from that deciding to stand all the way through the actual experience of being an MHK. And one thing that struck us in the broader electoral data analysis was that compared with, say, the House of Commons, the House of Keys is very volatile. So you have a lot of change of membership each general election. And that is not so much that MHKs are standing to be re-elected and losing, it's they are less likely to stand to be re-elected than their comparators in the House of Commons. So I think that gets across what a difficult role it is.
And certainly I can attest to, probably I could count on the fingers of one hand the really thoroughly unpleasant canvassing sessions that I had. There were probably about 5 people that I met during the 4 campaigns that I had. But those were very, very intimidating sessions, it's fair to say. And I guess it is a bit more difficult as a woman going into those sorts of settings, and something that's well, I wouldn't say necessarily unique to the Isle of Man, but it's unusual to see lone candidates going out in those situations.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it really is expected that a candidate will knock on everybody's door themselves, which is not the situation in the UK at all. And that there certainly, as Peter highlighted, were instances where some of the women who we interviewed had very uncomfortable situations, where they didn't necessarily feel that a man would have felt the same, where they felt slightly vulnerable, and also not just in terms of their own sort of perceived vulnerability, but the attitudes of family members as well. Saying, I don't want you going out leafleting at night. I don't want you going out doing this. And the way in which that kind of then impacted upon what they were able to do. And you would like to think that anybody standing for election would have a equal opportunity to knock on any door they like and canvass in any way they like. But the reality is that actually there were certain barriers there that some women felt that they had to be a little bit more careful, maybe not go out late at night, and therefore get round less houses than they would have liked to because of some of these issues.
And how do you overcome these issues? Is that something that you've concluded, or?
I think some of them are very difficult to dissociate from the broader political culture. I think a candidate who said, "I'm going to campaign for this constituency, but I'm not doing any doorstepping because there's some of the issues we've talked about." I think that would be a significant hurdle for them because the political culture emphasises that personal connection so much. So what we're talking about really is trying to get across to candidates an understanding of what they're letting themselves in for, and what they can plan around. And one of the big differences in the Isle of Man, not unique to the Isle of Man, but different from bigger democracies which are normally studied here, is that although there is a tradition of every general election being contested by some political parties, and the Manx Labour Party, for instance, has contested every general election since 1919, that parties are marginal in the Manx system. It is a Tynwald of independence, and the closest we could find to a time when there were nearly more party candidates was immediately after World War II, when there were a lot of very short-lived parties all jostling for position. But even then, it was still the majority of candidates, and sometimes the vast majority of candidates, are independents, which means that a lot of the mechanisms that other countries are looking to, which rely upon influencing the political parties to then make things change, really don't apply to somewhere like the Isle of Man. So, for instance, in Ireland, there is a link between gender inclusivity in your list of candidates and state funding to support your campaigning. Even if we had such a thing, there are so few candidates who are party political candidates, it wouldn't have a significant nudge effect. So I think there are some really interesting and not necessarily unique but very distinctive challenges. And
of course, one of the things that you're hoping to do is encourage women to turn out to find out all about this. What time is that session?
So this is an event that we're running on Wednesday evening at 6:30 till 8:30 at the Nunnery in Douglas. It's not just for women; it's for anybody who's wants to find out more about what life is like as an MHK, about the campaign process, and particularly for anybody who's considering or who has considered standing for election, to find out a little bit more about what they might face, what they might have to consider, who they might want to talk to in making that decision, and how they might make the best of the time that they have available to get their campaign underway.
I'd really strongly reinforce that. This is coming out of our findings of the Women in Manx Politics project, but a lot of the things that we found, we thought, actually that's going to be relevant to any candidate. And we're also interested in encouraging, for instance, people who are not Manx or English ethnically, because although that wasn't the subject of our study, there are arguments about representation and racial diversity as well. Disabled candidates, but also women candidates and male candidates who perhaps don't have a family member who's been in the Keys, aren't involved in party politics, haven't been involved in local government, don't have those existing connections. So it's a very inclusive event. We've got no connection with any party. We've got no connection with Tynwald or Cabinet Office. It's really just a civic society event to try and make it easier for people to think through whether or not they want to stand in a little over a year's time.
And I think, just picking up on that, as Peter said, we don't have a history of party politics on the island, and that does mean that the kind of traditional routes into politics and that political apprenticeship process for many people don't exist on the island. So what are the other ways in which you can gain sort of political experience and political knowledge? And our sort of more historical research was really helpful with that, in looking at kind of the background of some of the women who were standing for election and who were successful in that election. A lot of them had held elected office previously with the Board of Education, or they might have been Justice of the Peace or Magistrate. A lot of them had family who had been MHKs, a husband or a father. And so there were kind of various different ways in which people gained the knowledge and the experience of knowing their community and the campaign process that kind of would have helped them feel able to stand for election. And so we're kind of, most people don't have that. So what are the various things that might help them feel that they're able to stand?
And interestingly, of course, we've just had the first round, at least, of elections in relation to local authorities on the island, at which most of the local authorities had uncontested elections, which of course would mean that you wouldn't have to go around canvassing in the ways that we've described. And is local authority election, is that seen as a potential first step to the House of Keys by women, or is that not something you'd noticed?
I think it can be, but when we talked to women who had been in local government, they made it quite clear that it wasn't a means to an end. It wasn't, they thought, I will stand for the council, and then in 4 years' time I'll be in a good position to go for the Keys. It was, I'll stand for the council because there's things I want to do, there's a contribution I want to make here. So I think we shouldn't sort of downgrade local government as an end in itself for candidates. I think the point about uncontested is really, really interesting, and we have had instances when people said, oh well, the local government, you may not get the experience of campaigning, but you do get the experience of the actual work. Whereas the former island-wide Board of Education, that was much more likely to be contested, and so you would get the campaigning experience there.
So were there in the past a lot of women who had been, there weren't a lot of women because there haven't been a lot of women MHKs, but of the women that became MHKs, had many of them had experience in local government?
Yeah, they had. So if we look at the kind of 11 women who served as MHKs during the 20th century, I think, let me try and remember now, I think 4 of them had served as commissioners or on Douglas Council. I think another 4 of them had served on the Board of Education, or whatever it was called, the equivalent. And a couple of them had been Justice of the Peace. So they did have that. And as Peter said, it's not necessarily, I'm fairly certain they didn't go into it thinking, I'm going to stand to be an MHK. But it certainly would have given them insight and perhaps spurred them on to say, well, actually, if I can do this, there's more that I would like to contribute, and I can't do it here. So maybe going for the House of Keys was the next step for them.
And I think as we move into the 21st century, there's probably more variety in backgrounds. And one of the things that struck us was that the time frame of that decision to stand was really, really variable. So in the UK system, if you wanted to stand as a party representative for the House of Commons, that is not a decision you make in the immediate run up to the election. There is a whole backstory behind you becoming the official candidate. Some of the candidates we talked to had it on the back of their minds for a while, and then they realised who was standing in the constituency that they lived in, and they thought, oh, what a choice that is, and stood. So you had people make very, very decisions crystallising very, very close to the actual election. You also had women who had been thinking, this is something that I am going to do. I need to plan. It's going to be expensive. I need to build up my financial reserves in order to do the campaign, and had been planning literally 2 or 3 years ahead. So that's one of the reasons, even though it's only 2025, we wanted to do the event this year.
We've heard about one of the pioneers of the whole women in politics. That was the unsuccessful woman, Mrs. Nelson. What about the first successful woman MHK?
Well, interestingly, the first two successful women MHKs were both members of the Manx Labour Party. So Annie Bridson she'd stood in 1946 but didn't get elected, but she was elected in 1951, and she was one of the founding members of the Manx Labour Party way back in 1918, and she actually became president of the Manx Labour Party in 1922. And she stood, her husband had been an MHK previously, but she stood in 1951 and was successful. And one of the things that we'd kind of looked at was the extent to which women were standing as women candidates rather than just candidates. And we see right through from really from Annie Bridson in 1951 to probably the mid-70s, women making quite explicit reference to the fact that they were a women candidate and women should come out to vote and women should do this. And Annie Bridson was very, very pro-equality, and a lot of what she did in the Keys was about equality of representation. It wasn't until 1955 that women could vote in local elections, and that was something that she pushed very, very much.
Gosh, 1955, that's shocking.
And one of her arguments was that voting in local elections is where women learn about the voting process, because you're much closer, or you should be much closer to those candidates than you maybe are to your MHK. But the first woman to be elected was also a Labour Party member, Marion Shimmin. Her husband had been a founding member of the Labour Party, and he was Peel's representative from 1919 right through until he died in 1933, and she was elected unopposed in his seat, effectively standing on the same candidate. So I think to some extent it didn't matter that she was a women candidate. The electorate knew what they were going to get. She was a Labour Party member. She was standing on the same ticket that he was. And she was elected unopposed in that by-election and elected again in the general election the following year. And we've had, really, it's been an absolutely fascinating part of the research, looking back at some of the women who have served in the Keys and the work that they have done. We have Jean Thornton Dewsbury, who some listeners might just remember, who was again, and interestingly enough, she didn't have a particularly political background or political outlook. There were a couple of candidates, her included, who essentially decided to stand for election because various people in their constituencies said, "Why don't you stand for election?" And she thought, "Oh, all right then, I'll do that." So, they didn't necessarily go in with a kind of particular mandate. But I've lost my train of thought there.
That's right. No, it's fascinating.
Can I just chip in on Marion Shimmin?
Yeah, certainly.
So you do often find, sort of in very brief biographies of her, that she was elected unopposed, and I suppose I have a couple of concerns about that emphasis. One of which is the suggestion that she was like a placeholder for her deceased husband, so people, there was no other candidate because it was felt that she should inherit it. The other thing is, I think the emphasis on unopposed is kind of stressing this idea that, well, would she have been up for the cut and thrust of a contested election? Would she have been able to campaign against a man for these sorts of issues? And what I find quite interesting is even quite recent sources stress this. Manx, New Manx Worthies, the very first thing they say about Marion Shimmin is that she was returned unopposed. And actually, loads of 20th century candidates were unopposed. There was a representative for the Keys in Castletown, Joseph Qualtrough. He was elected 7 times, which is pretty cool. 6 of them he was unopposed. You will not find anything in the literature or online saying Joseph David Qualtrough, the unopposed MHK. So I think that's an example about how things can be presented in a way which is not quite the same for men and for women. And
Katrina, has the thought returned?
Agreed. No, it hasn't, I'm afraid. Sorry.
All right. Yeah. Well, one thing that I suppose does surprise me really about all this is, we were pretty radical in the Isle of Man in terms of granting allowing women to vote. I mean, it sounds dreadful just saying it out loud, really, but the fact that it happened here way before it happened in many other countries, you would have thought that the prejudices would have been less obvious, and more women would have stood and got elected at an earlier stage.
Well, there was some discussion in 1880, just before some women were given the vote, about whether women should be allowed to stand for the keys. And Richard Sherwood, who had kind of proposed that women should be allowed to vote, effectively said, if we're giving women the vote, I have no objection to them being allowed to stand for election. But he did meet some quite stiff opposition. One of the other MHKs, I seem to remember, said that women were far too emotional to be able to stand in the House of Keys. And shockingly, those types of attitudes, we see them 100 years later being expressed on the record in Tynwald about, for example, whether women should be allowed to stand for jury duty. So women were not allowed to serve on Manx juries until 1980. And some of the reasons against it were, women couldn't handle that. There are things that were being discussed that women shouldn't have to see, or, women were too illogical. So unfortunately, those attitudes prevailed for quite some time.
And have those attitudes completely died out, do you think?
I think things are an awful lot better than they were, not least in terms of what is perceived to be acceptable rhetoric. So we would no longer... So some of the language that we saw, even in the early 1990s, so we as part of the project, we looked at two specific sets of debates. One on whether women should serve on Manx juries, which actually ran from 1920 right through to 1980, when women were finally allowed to sit on the jury. And also the sexual offences, amendments to the Sexual Offences Act in the late 80s and early 90s. Primarily because we knew in that case that there was a woman MHK, Hazel Hannon, who was very vociferous in her support for this and had received quite a lot of backlash in the House of Keys. And so we still see, even in the early 1990s, some of that type of misogynistic language about a woman's place and what a woman should think and what a woman should feel and should support and shouldn't. I think it is much less acceptable to have that on the public record now. I suspect there's still a little bit of that about, but certainly not to the extent that it was acceptable 40 years ago.
And Peter...
And the broader literature talks about the idea of a critical mass. So a point at which there are a sufficiently large number of women in a legislature that it stops being what, to quote many of our respondents, saying about the old Tynwald, an old boys club. It becomes a more inclusive group, and it's not sort of like women are in a male institution. It becomes a more equal institution. And often the global literature says 30% is about that. So certainly when we were talking to women MHKs and former MHKs, there was a feeling that as we got towards the 2010s, something shifted because of the number of women who were in the Keys. And obviously they're not a homogenous group. They will frequently disagree about particular policy issues, but there was something about the number of women and therefore their impact on the culture of the Keys, which is really important. So to echo Katrina, I'm sure there are still issues within Tynwald, but also outside of Tynwald with constituents. But the overall picture that we got was that it was a much more positive environment for women.
But I think also, and one of the reasons why I think it's important that we hold this event next Wednesday is that I don't think we can be complacent about it. We've seen periods in the past, in the 1970s, for example, where you had, so from 1974 to 1976, you had 4 women sitting in the House of Keys. And had that been now, we might have thought, oh, we've reached critical mass, we're going to be fine. But actually, you see numbers drop significantly after that, to no women candidates at all, to one woman candidate, to two women candidates. So I think even though in this last election and the one before, we have seen a big sea change, I don't think we can guarantee that means that this level of gender equality necessarily is going to continue. And certainly, looking at the academic literature and also looking at what's happening in parliaments elsewhere in Britain, there are still significant issues with maintaining that gender diversity and with women feeling that they are equals when sitting in Parliament.
I remember coming back from a Commonwealth Parliamentary conference. I didn't attend many of them, but on this one occasion I did, and representation of women in Parliament was one of the topics that was discussed. And at the time there were 3 women in the Manx Parliament, and I came to the Manx branch of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and explained, what had happened at this conference, and said, perhaps there are things that we should be considering in the Isle of Man to try and improve the situation. And it's fair to say that I got quite a bit of stick from the women who were quite concerned that it wouldn't be seen that we were in some way trying to rig the system to make it easier for women.
It's interesting you should say that, because one of the questions we asked was, did women kind of, to what extent were women supportive of each other in the Keys? And those women who kind of sat in the Keys after 2016 did say that yes, it was a very supportive environment and women did support each other. The women who had sat in the Keys before 2016 had quite a different view of it, that not only were there no, I think somebody referred to it as cliques of women, that would have been a very negative thing, and that quite a few of our participants made this point that, when you sit in the Keys, you are a member. You're not a male member or a woman or a female member, you are just a member, and that there should be no distinction between them. And interestingly enough, the period in the 1970s that I'd mentioned earlier, where you had 4 women standing, that was enough to shift the balance, whereby when they were redeveloping the parliamentary estate, it was decided to put in a lady members' room, and that was welcomed by the women in the Keys at the time. But by the time we get to the late 1980s, and there were kind of grumbles about, well, we only have 2 women in the Keys, and do we really need a separate room, and we could put it to much better use. And you have Hazel Hannon, for example, saying, this is very outdated. Why do we need a separate room for women? We're all members of the House of Keys. We should all be using the same spaces.
What I mean, Peter, you were referring earlier to trying to encourage not just more women, but more people from a range of diverse backgrounds to the Isle of Man. Why is that so important? I mean, I'm asking a reasonably obvious question, but there may be some people listening who'll be thinking, well, surely to goodness we just want people who've got good political ideas. It doesn't matter too much about where their background is.
Yeah, and I think I'd start that by saying that there's a couple of different ways we can use the word representative. So you find, interestingly, in the early women's suffrage movement in England and Wales, there was a lot of emphasis on women should have the vote and much less emphasis on women should be able to stand for the House of Commons, because it was felt that so long as women could vote for the candidate, they could choose whichever man would best represent their interests and their concerns. So if you see the representative purely as a channel for the will of their constituents, then I completely see where you're coming from. Now, some very good representatives may not realise that they should be thinking about the keys, because they look at who the House of Keys are and they don't see themselves reflected there. The other issue, and I think this applies particularly in relation to women, is that if you don't see people who share some of your characteristics involved in political life, you may not see yourself in that position. So one of the arguments about critical mass is that when you have enough women of all different political stripes with all different political opinions working in the legislative chamber, that creates a mental space for women who would be good representatives, so women and men, to see themselves in that chamber. And we got a lovely quote during one of our interviews, which is where an MHK had showed around a group of school children around the chamber, and one of the female school children said, where are all the girl pictures? Because obviously there's all of the pictures of Director Good and Tynwald, and almost entirely male. And Katrina and I ran an event last year where we were in the one of the halls in Douglas Corporation, and it was very different. You could see the females being represented in the official photographs dating back to the 50s.
Yeah.
So I think you don't want people to think they can't stand because they think, oh, well, my face wouldn't fit. I'm not the sort of person who becomes an MHK. And there is also this broader idea that actually you want the chamber to be representative in many ways. I mean, ideally, you would want the chamber legislatures to be more intelligent, more capable, more sagacious than the rest of us. But in many other ways, you want it to be representative.
And also, I think, the parliamentary estate itself is portrayed as quite elite and quite masculine. If you think about the setup of the chamber, whether it's House of Keys or Tynwald Court, it's not very open and very welcoming. It's not a setup that lends itself to kind of building consensus and quiet, considered debate. It's almost designed to be confrontational. I don't know if it was modelled on the House of Commons chamber, but it is very similar to that. And I think, again, that can be quite off-putting for people who are not from that background, who don't have experience of being in places like that with that level of formality. And as Peter says, it is literally quite a masculine environment, just looking at the pictures on the walls. And the other thing that some of our participants sort of commented on was that the seating arrangements, it was quite clearly, and we know that both chambers were designed before women were allowed to stand for the keys. So the seats are very big. If you want to sit on the desk, you've got to sit at the edge of your chair. The temperature is not necessarily useful for women who aren't there with their big tweed blazers on. So I think there are various things just about the environment that can make it quite exclusionary or feel quite exclusionary. And I think the more that you can see ordinary women sitting in those seats and behaving that way, and again, I'm sorry if we've already touched on this. The feedback that we had was that the tone of the debate definitely changed from 2016 onwards. That it was much less confrontational, much less aggressive, much more consensual, and the idea that there is a different type of politics there, but people need to see that that's possible before they might decide themselves that I could be a part of that.
And is that down to the fact that there are more women since 2016, or perhaps some would argue, certainly those of us who were at the sharp end of tongue lashings from Peter Carron, would suggest that 2016 was when Peter left the chamber, and perhaps that's why things became less confrontational. But I don't know.
I'm going to let Peter answer that one.
It's very hard to show the causation, particularly when you have such small chambers where one individual can make a massive difference to the overall tone. So, would we have seen the change, if there was a change post 2016, with a different set of MHKs, because they were representing a different society which had moved on in the way it expected people to interact? Possibly.
So obviously this particular iteration of the House of Keys has more women representation, I think, than any other, and certainly the government of the Isle of Man during the course of the last 3.5 years has had more women representation, particularly ministers. What should we be? I mean, what differences should we be expecting to see, or indeed should we be expecting to see any difference at all?
Not necessarily. I think what, in essence, any woman and anybody who every MHK is bringing their own perspective. And I think when you have women bring a unique perspective, people from different backgrounds bring a unique perspective. And I think in the past, certainly, there was a perspective that women were better equipped to speak on particular issues. And I think nowadays we're kind of a lot more accepting that actually women can speak on any issue, but they bring their unique perspective to it. And that can be quite helpful for the diversity of the chamber in general.
And are we expecting, as a result of your meeting on Wednesday, to see even more women, perhaps even finding a situation where men are in the minority in the House of Keys? Either.
I think it would be astonishing if an event made such a big difference.
We can, but
very, very obviously very pleasing in terms of impact. But I think more seriously, there's a point at which a gender imbalance, whether too many men or not enough men, is a problem to the legitimacy and the range of expertise within the chamber. Once you're past that threshold, then you are bound to find differences in each chamber. I mean, even in a very large chamber like the House of Commons, you're going to find differences. In a small chamber like the House of Keys, I think when I did the work on the last election, in one constituency, if 50 votes had gone a different way, we would have had a slightly larger number of women in the chamber, for instance. So I think agonising about 50-50 is probably not worthwhile. If we reached a point where 80% of MHKs were female and 20% were male, then I would hope that Katrina and I, our successors, would be saying, what is it about the political system which is not encouraging men to stand, or if they do stand, to be so poorly elected?
Yeah.
Some have suggested that one of the reasons that there haven't been as many women in politics in the past century is because they've got more sense than the men. Is that a fair comment?
I don't think so. No, I think there have been significant barriers in place, and there remain significant barriers in place. I think that would give people pause for thought about standing for election. I think if you do have household responsibilities, then taking on a job like that can be very challenging. And if you compare it to other jobs where you can, you have the option of working part-time, or you have the option of working particular hours or flexi time or whatever, you don't have that in the role of MHK. And I think there probably are more things that Tynwald could do to make the role more attractive and easier for a broader majority of people to consider.
And just to pursue the more sense point, it's interesting that exactly that phrase was used to exclude women from juries. They have more sense to be involved in public life. They have other priorities which we need to recognise. They will think it's more important to have dinner on the table for their husband than it is to decide whether or not somebody is guilty or innocent. But taking it seriously, do we want a situation where people showing more sense will not represent people in the House of Keys? Do we not want the House of Keys to be composed of very sensible people?
Absolutely. Well, I certainly do. And I come across quite a few sensible people in the interviews that I do, which often air on these programmes. But certainly it's a fascinating topic. I mean, one charge I suspect, and we haven't got time to go into this that could be levied at this whole discussion is that actually there's far more important things to worry about, like sorting out the housing crisis, sorting out the health crisis. But I guess having better representation and doing that is not a bad thing.
Agreed.
But think of it like the way you use your computer. You don't use your computer because you think the operating system is fantastic. You use it because it's got all the apps that do the things you want it to do. And these sort of constitutional issues are the operating system of everything else that we need, So I do understand there are more pressing concerns, but if we always allow issues around the Constitution and representation and the operating system of the Constitution to be pushed away, we'd only really look at them when there's an absolute crisis. And there are places we could look at in the world at the moment where you would think, it would have been useful if this had been thought about in a calmer time.
That was Dr. Katrina Mackie and Professor Peter Edge. So what do you think? Do we need more women in Manx politics? Has having more women in the Keys and Ledgeco made a difference? I'm Phil Gorn. Goramayasan Geishachrom. Thanks for listening.